Beautiful televiewers of your Pan-African channel for you Media Africa and listeners of the Pan-African Radio, you're welcome to today's edition of Talking Point. Today we shall be discussing the internal displacement or forceful internal displacement of persons across the African continent. Although internal displacement is a global problem, it has long been a particular concern for African governments. According to the most recent estimates from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, acronym the IDMC, conflict and violence have uprooted close to 37.9 million people out of their homes in sub-Saharan Africa in 2023 from over 21.8 million in 2022. While a rising trend driven each year by other factors such as natural hazard-induced disasters, risks, climate risks and a deficiency of durable solutions. The center stressed a record-breaking high of 75.9 million globally. The report finds conflicts in Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo and out of the African continent, that is Palestinian territories, accounted for nearly two-thirds of new displacements due to violence, which in total spanned 66 countries in 2023. The same report states that a total of the total, we saw 68.3 million displaced by conflict and violence, while 7.7 million by disasters across the world. Well, we're looking at almost half, that is 46% of all IDPs in sub-Saharan Africa. So then 6 million internal displacements of forced movements by conflict during 2023 were more than its previous 14 years combined. Ladies and gentlemen, how can the African continent address this global challenge? Join us as we unpack this with our panel in the course of this edition. Stay with us. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, this is Talking Point over your Pan-African channel for you Media Africa. But today we're discussing the forceful displacements of Africans due to conflict, violence or disasters, as well as forced by different factors. We're discussing these in the course of this edition, and this follows a report done by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC, with regards to displacements across the globe. Well, a panel of today constitutes of Dr. Stanley FONGOD, who is a Pan-Africanist, joining us all the way from the U.S. Greetings to you, sir. You're welcome to this edition.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Sharon, and thank our viewers all over the world and the co-panelists for joining us well. I hope that we'll have a fruitful conversation today.
Absolutely. We look forward to having fruitful conversations around today's topic of discussion. We're currently be joined by Lady NADYNE MEZOH, who is the Secretary General of the Cameroon branch of the International Human Rights Commission Relief Fund Trust. You're welcome to this edition, ma'am.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Good afternoon, doctor, and it's nice meeting you here, and I hope we have a swell time together.
Absolutely. Thank you for honoring today's invitation. Meanwhile, before we dive right into the discussions, let's welcome this report in a bit to comprehend what surrounds today's topic of discussion, done for us by Lumshu.
The new report by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC, which was published on Tuesday, May 14, reveals that conflict in Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Palestinian territories accounted for nearly two-thirds of new displacements due to violence, which in total spanned 66 countries in 2023. According to the director of the IDMC, Alexandra Bilak, over the past 2 years, alarming new levels have been witnessed of people having to flee their homes due to conflict and violence, even in regions where the trend had been improving. She said in a statement Tuesday that millions of people forced to flee in 2023 were just the tip of the iceberg. The report equally points out that the number of internal displacement, that is the number of times people have been forced to move throughout the year to escape conflict within their country, has increased in the last couple of years. The United Nations Refugee Agency UNHCR in its 2023 report on forcibly displaced populations disclosed that 62.5 million people had been internally displaced at the end of 2022 compared to 36.4 million refugees who had fled conflict, violence and persecution that same year. According to the IDMC, no internal displacements last year were mostly due to the conflict in Ukraine, which started in 2022, as well as to the ongoing conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the eruption of war in mid-April 2023 in Sudan.
Like you heard in the report, we are analyzing how Africa can prevent forced internal displacement across the continent. Well, to kickstart with you, NADYNE, when you listen to the report, well, the director of that center, Alexander Bilak, did state that the fleeing or movement of people in 2023 was just a tip of the iceberg. Being the Secretary General of the Cameroon branch of the International Human Rights Commission, how do you, what accounts, in your opinion, to this rise in forceful displacements of persons across the African continent?
Well, if I may want to say with regards to the footage we just saw, I want to think that it's some sort of a poverty alleviation and economic development that is causing a lot of people to, migrate from where they are. That is causing a lot of IDPs that we have all over the African continent.
Exactly. We equally have countries like Cameroon that witnessed tensions since 2016 and have been ongoing, or seeing people moving massively from their region of origin to find themselves solace in other parts of the country. Now, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, in your opinion, what accounts for this massive rise in forceful displacements of persons across the African continent, and of course, how do we analyze this current phenomenon? It happens to be a global challenge.
I think that we have to basically start thinking about the huge volume of conflicts that we have basically, spreading across the globe, especially on the African continent. We have too many conflicts on this, in Africa. And if you look at countries like the DRC, look at countries like Sudan, you look at countries like Ethiopia, Cameroon, Somalia. These are all hotspots. And recently, we have a lot of portions of the Sahel that is also going through this mass displacement of people, either internally or across, across international borders within the continent of Africa. Folks are moving, and this has a lot to do with conflicts and violence. Yes, obviously, we have the issues of poverty. Well, we have the issues of those who are basically looking for greener pastures elsewhere. But most people who have been forced out of their homes have been done so by the barrel of a gun. And so obviously we are having people who are looking for safer havens where they can actually, run into safety. The whole entire region around the Goma in Democratic Republic of Congo is having close to about, I think, more than 5-point-something million people has been displaced just around Goma alone. And it's one of those things in which we have to be able to grapple with the fact that we have a lot of folks on the African continent who are dealing, with a lot of issues so far as conflict is concerned, and all they can do is to run and find where they can be able to have safer havens. That's the issues we are facing before we start even thinking about the economic issues which we need to address. But the political issues, which results to these conflicts needs to be addressed as well.
Exactly. It's not just a problem of every country, but it's a collective effort. Back to the international community here. Back to you, NADYNE. You listen to your co-panelists, and it should be noted that many times when people tend to move forcefully from their region of origin or from their homes, we see the rights of women and children being violated. And now, as a rep or representative of the HRC, how are their rights being protected to ensure that we don't see, say, a human rights violation escalating across Africa?
Okay, with regards to the women and the girl child, to ensure that they don't go through all of these hazards, we try to it I don't know, if the government can, work hand in gloves with us, with the human rights organizations, to see that these girls get to some safe space, that they create safe shelters for them, education, that get them occupied in activities that can, dissuade them away from things that will put them in harm's way.
Unfortunately, we can hear you, Nadine. Please, can you proceed? Are you able to get us?
Can you get me?
Yes, I can hear you. Please proceed.
Yeah, like I was saying, the collaboration between the government and the human rights organizations to help shelter for these girls, create trainings for them, education that can, dissuade them away from, or keep them away from harm's way. That, I think, that is one of the ways that we can take care of the girl child from all of these incidents that are going on around.
Okay, now staying with you, we're cognizant of the fact that not just girls, also women are being faced with challenges like human rights abuse and a host of others. Now, what are some of the challenges that not just the Human Rights, International Human Rights Commission faces on the ground in terms of the protection of human rights across the continent?
Well, in terms of the protection of human rights across the continent, I think some states do not yet understand that the human rights are supposed to work hand in gloves with them to protect this, to protect the woman, as we stated. So, but I think that as one of the challenges, like I earlier said, is for us to work together to create a ground where, sorry, the lines went off. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello?
We are able to hear you. Can you proceed?
Hello? Hello?
Okay, meanwhile, while you're trying to get that done or get that sorted out, I would like to take back Dr. Stanley FONGOD. Okay, now you listen to your co-panelists, but then we mentioned earlier on that human rights protection is faced with numerous challenges across Africa. Now, how do you think government as well as human rights institutions can address this problem across the continent?
I think we need to be able to break down exactly what's happening, especially when it comes to the issues we have, on the continent, on the conflict and violence front. First of all, we have a lot of armed conflicts, and this comes as a result of those who are basically seeking to gain territories or who are looking for some kind of a political change so far as a country is concerned. And whenever a country basically melts down as a result of our own inconsistency within our own political structures, what eventually happens is that neighboring countries will basically have to feel the effect of what is going on in those countries. We have seen this in Nigeria, we have seen this in Cameroon, we have seen this, especially if you go to the eastern part of Cameroon, you see a lot of internally displaced now over across the border people within Central African Republic that are seeking shelter, on the other side of the border into Cameroon. So these are some of the issues that we basically need to be able to take care of. We have to also have this clear-cut understanding that there are ethnic issues, on the continent of Africa that needs to be taken care of. And I think that if you look at what is happening on the ethnic front, Cameroon actually is a prime example as to what's happening. If you look at the western part or the Anglophone zone in Cameroon, those are ethnic conflicts, and which needs to be addressed. So I think that we have to come to a place where dialogue becomes one of the tools in which governments must fully address. The reasons being, we mostly on the African continent, we are separated, not actually based upon ethnic ideologies or our cultures as a people, but we are actually separated based upon pseudo things that has been placed on us as Africans. For example, Anglophone, Francophone. Who is an Anglophone? Somebody who basically has, an allegiance with the Anglo-Saxon system, which is basically British in nature. Who is a Francophone? Somebody who basically sits over there and basically have an allegiance with something from France. That person is a Francophone. Okay, French cultures, French ideas. It's not typically Cameroonian. It's not African. If I was having a conflict, for example, in Cameroon, with somebody who is a Bassa, or somebody who is a Wondo, or somebody who is from Mankor, or somebody who is from Bali, or whatever community you come from within Cameroon, that will be legitimate. It will make a lot of sense to me. But if we are going to have conflicts because somebody wake up in the morning and say bonjour, another person says good morning, and that becomes the reason to which we basically has to pull our heads off, that is a little bit insane. So I'm thinking that we really have to first of all start choosing our battles and finding ways in which we can address these issues and address them in such a way that we understand firmly what we are actually fighting for. I think that is what we need to do.
Absolutely. It's all about diversity, knowing that there's unity in diversity per se. You earlier on mentioned that dialogue could be a tool, positive tool in addressing this problem of forceful internal displacement of persons. Now, how can governments capitalize on this aspect?
Well, I'm thinking that the moment we begin to realize that force really does not solve anything, that you can use violence to be able to quench someone's thirst for freedom or someone's ambitions or aspirations for liberation, that you literally have to bring that person where you convince them about the path of their aspiration and the path of their freedom that they need to take, that will be communal, that will benefit everyone, then that will be legitimate. The moment you take the barrel of a gun and you try to persuade someone that this is what they need to do and this is how they must do it, I think that it will bring us to a place where it will be extremely very difficult, to get people who will be able to agree to that. And what that happens is it pushes each and every one of us to pick up guns and then we start fighting. I think that we need to be able to understand the power of dialogue. Having conversations with somebody and being able to say, I understand exactly where you're coming from. I understand exactly what you're asking for, but can we be able to negotiate about it? You see, there is this beauty about our first institution, which is very African in nature. The first university, so far as I'm concerned, was on the African continent in a place called Timbuktu. It was called, it still is there, it's called the Sankore University. One-time lecturer at that university would be a man who is of great admiration to me, Ahmed Baba. And this was an Islamic university. And the beauty of a university is literally us having unity in diversity, all right? University, having unity in diversity. Diversity of thoughts, diversity of ideas, diversity in the way we think. That is the beauty of our civilization. We can never go forward if we do not have people with opposing ideas. It is those opposing ideas that basically has given us the technology we have today, that has given us the society we have today. In other words, we are not monolithic. We do not just agree. We are not supposed to agree on the same thing. No, we need to be able to sit down and have healthy debates. Those healthy debates are needed. But the moment you keep telling somebody to shut up, the moment you keep telling somebody to not say anything, that means you do not have the capacity to speak, then that drives each and every one of us to a place where conflict becomes inevitable. And the reality is for somebody who, you can only tell somebody to shut up for so long, and the reality is that somebody will also be only afraid for the barrel of a gun for so long. Sooner or later, they will say to themselves, if this is what it is, if it's death, then let us die. And unfortunately, that's the state of affairs on the African continent.
Africans will need to review that as pertains solutions to African problems. Now, aside dialogue, We're seeing a dialogue which you elaborated on, but aside that aspect, what other measures or solutions could be explored for the African continent to be able to curb the rise in forceful displacement? Because we should note that people do move every day, sometimes, especially as the African continent is advocating for the implementation of the African continental free trade area, where we're going to be seeing a movement of people, voluntary movement of people to other parts of the African continent, so as to boost trade, so as to boost growth, so as to boost development. But now curbing the fact of forceful displacement of persons due to conflict, violence, or disasters, like you mentioned in your preamble, what other aspects could be explored for the African continent to be able to curb this phenomenon?
Well, I think that we need to be able to address this whole entire thing, especially when it comes to solutions. We need to basically start thinking about areas, especially in agriculture. And I think that agriculture plays a vital role on the African continent, because whether people are moving voluntarily or they're moving because of conflict, most people will always gravitate towards where food supply is abundant. And so agriculture becomes something else that needs to absolutely be encouraged on the African continent. So three things we need to do so far agriculture is concerned. I think that we need to basically find ways to modernize and improve on our technology outlook so far as agriculture is concerned. We have to be able to find ways in which we basically bring in technologies that will help us on the African continent so that we can improve, on our production yearly, and also improve on the type of seeds we use in planting, and also the types of fertilizer we use. One of the things I love a lot about agriculture on the African continent is because most of our agriculture on the African continent is organic. It's non-GMO, all right? So GMO means for genetically modified organisms. So it's none of that. That means we are still at the original natural state of things. So I think that we really need to be able to improve on the technology in agriculture. We have to basically improve on our value chain and processing, where if you manufacture cocoa, convert that to something called chocolate, before shipping that overseas, or at least convert it into something else, not just shipping cocoa beans out of the country. That's crazy, because out of the country, whichever country you ship it to, they're actually employing a lot of people to be able to handle, and work in those plants so that they can be able to increase their production yield and also their GDP. We have to be able to start looking at ways in which we can be able to help enhance that. Without that, I think it will be extremely quite difficult for us to deal with these issues in the long run.
Exactly, that is a problem. That is not just a global problem. Let's reiterate that the IDMC did state that 75.9 million people had been displaced globally in 2023, which differed from 21.8 million in 2022, according to figures from sub-Saharan Africa. Now, you mentioned agriculture, which is it's a viral part. It's a very important part on the African continent. It should be noted that about 60% of arable land on the continent is yet untapped into. Now, with all this, why is it so much important to understand the unique plight of internally displaced persons across the African continent?
Look, the idea is this: if you have people who are moving across international borders, or even they're moving across state lines within their own individual countries, you call it provinces like in Cameroon or states in Nigeria, the truth of the matter is that people are moving either because they are absolutely looking for greener pastures, or in this case, we talk about IDPs, the general idea is that they're actually being forced to move because of violence. But agriculture plays a vital role, because whether they're moving or not moving, at some particular point in time, we have these refugee camps, and we rely on the international community to be able to send us food and feed us. The UN has been doing this, for over 40, 50 years now. And they have done so, faithfully, especially in war-torn countries, of coming in and helping out. I mean, you have to give that up to United Nations. I'm not a fan of the UN, period. But concerning what they have done so far as, basically meeting certain needs, in conflict, in war-torn countries and conflict zones. I think that they have done tremendous work. And, if there be anything else, we have to give kudos to them for that which they're doing on the continent on that front. But I'm also thinking that time has come for Africans to be able to feed themselves. And the way for us to do that is to make sure that we have a lot of funding, in the agri sector, so that we can actually improve and bring a lot of young people into the sector. For example, if you tell somebody that you're a farmer, and folks will look at you and they will laugh. They'll be like, what the hell are you talking about? You're a farmer? Well, except you start telling them that somebody like Bill Gates, the richest person in the world, one of the richest person in the world, is also involved in agriculture. Mm-hmm. Is also involved in farming. One of the largest landowner in America is Bill Gates, right? For what? Agriculture, not to build computers, not to, expand Microsoft. No. Agriculture. And I think that we have to come into this consciousness that we basically start pushing young people that they have to get into agriculture rather than just sitting and waiting for some guy in a blue suit, to employ them in some office, for them to go sit behind the computer, and kill their dreams, build the person's dreams while their own ideas and dreams basically die in the process. Once you understand that you can literally, there is no limit to how far you can go so far as agriculture is concerned, and you understand the value that you can bring to a particular community, I think that will basically increase. And the side effect of that is it's going to bring young people who otherwise will start creating trouble in communities, okay, whatever it is, joining groups like Boko Haram. One of the greatest displacement on the African continent is actually around the Lake Chad Basin, and this is because of the terrorist group Boko Haram. Northeast Nigeria has experienced tremendous pain because of this particular group. So has Cameroon. 40% of all the internal displaced people in Cameroon are actually around the Lake Chad Basin, and because of Boko Haram. We have to find ways in which we can be able to get these young people to be involved in agriculture in the luscious land around Gandari and places like Garoua, all right, where they can actually be able to help, cultivate, help develop this arable land, and in the process also export some of those produce if Cameroon cannot be able to consume it all. That's the goal, that's the ambition that young people should have, and para-governmental organizations should be able to start looking into this. How do we fund these projects? How do we build these self-reliance ideas where young people can be involved in agriculture? Agriculture alone will play a vital role. Talk less of things like infrastructure, technology, but just agriculture. Plenty of ideas, plenty of mindset to be able to harvest within this sector.
Absolutely. Let's recall that during the just ended African Farm and Soil Health Summit that took place in Nairobi, Kenya, we had African heads of state and governments that did conclude that it was a prerequisite for African leaders to be united to solidify their efforts in a bid to boost this sector, like you mentioned, the agricultural sector, one which is key to the development and growth of the African continent. Now, Aaron, you mentioned an aspect of refugees. Many a time we've seen displaced persons driven by conflict, driven by violence across the African continent, often referred to as refugees, and this goes a long way in putting them or making them much more vulnerable, the most vulnerable people of society. Now, with this in mind, how can that aspect of internally displaced persons be regarded as refugees be addressed across Africa?
I think that we don't have to look far. Presently, you are transmitting from Douala, and I happen to have been in the country a couple of months ago, maybe around years ago, or almost a year ago, and I was visiting a place in Douala called, I think they call it Rue de Rajoie, a place where they sell fish and whatnot. So we went out there and we were eating. And I remember very well one of the young waitress that actually came to serve us. She must have been not more than 12 years old. And she was pregnant. And the gentleman I was with said to me, she is Anglophone. And so when she walked over to me, the question I asked her was this: where you from? And she said she's from Kumba, precisely. And this is a young girl who basically ran, obviously she told me she ran away from the war, and she ran away from a bullet, all right, in Kumba, and she literally got molested in Douala. And this is a reoccurring theme across the continent. It's not just uniquely Cameroon. All right, it's reoccurring across the continent. There is a cascading effect as to what we do. And the problem is, most often at times, we do not understand that most of the conflicts that we engineer and the lack of the fact that we do not have the capacity to sit down and be able to bring long-lasting solutions to these issues, it creates a scenario where the victims will live longer than when the barrels of the gun would have stopped sounding. All right, that the effects of the war will go for generations to come, and there were people who would never recover. The trauma as a result of this, will continue, and we'll have 2 to 3 generations of young people who will forever, be handicapped one way or the other, either psychological, mentally, or physically, as a result of this conflict. And this is the reality as to what's happening on the continent. I think that we basically need to start investing a lot in education. And the reason for that is because I'm of the opinion that if we be able to help young people on the continent of Africa get into some form of vocational training, where we're not just teaching them things that is quite arbitrary, not just, the way things has been, but teaching young people to own a skill, where they can be able to get out of our educational systems and be self-employed, without depending on somebody to be able to come and employ them. If that was going to be the case, anyone who has a job, who has the capacity to be able to take care of themselves, will think twice before they carry a gun. Anyone who has a livelihood, who has something to lose, will not jeopardize that by carrying the gun to fight for something that they fully do not understand. I think that we basically need to address this. Without which, if you have a bunch of young people, educated or uneducated, in relationship to whatever you want to call term education, which is most likely what I call certification, who basically has 0 skills, eventually you will have trouble because they will not be able to get any kind of employment. There will be very few people trying to employ a whole lot of people. And in the end, or a lot of people competing for very few positions to those who are actually hiring. And in the end, you have young people who are totally disenfranchised, and that leads to violence, that leads to crime. And eventually, communities have been destabilized across the world because of this. So I think that time has come for us to be able to find ways in which we can be able to handle these issues also from the academic front.
Before looking at the academic front, let's recall the African Union in 2020 had brought up the initiative of silencing the guns, and that was later on pushed to a target of 2030. We discussed this in our previous editions, but then when you look at this aspect, let's get back to the reports done by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC, that stated that most of this forceful displacement of persons across Africa were being linked to conflicts and violence. Now, with this in mind, you earlier on mentioned that Africa will need to address the issue of silencing the guns, or say curbing the barrel of the gun, the use of the barrel of the gun in the African continent. With this, how can Africa end the proliferation of conflicts and probably of violence across Africa so it doesn't lead to the forceful displacement of persons?
We need to basically get into the areas of conflict resolutions and peace building. We need to be able to find ways to have young people, educate them, train them, send them out into the field where they can start being, they can start engineering an agenda that is uniquely African and Pan-African in nature. When you have somebody who basically comes from the Middle East, who is singing or who is dancing to the tune of Islam, who comes into a community and tells you that you need to believe in Islam, and you do, and the next thing he tells you is that anyone who do not believe in Islam is an infidel. And then you believe that ideology to the fact that you picked up a gun and start behaving like Boko Haram and start beheading people, killing people, doing whatever you have to because people do not believe to that fringe idea of Islam. That is the basis of the pain in which you are facing. We have to be able to educate our young people in a Pan-African agenda that excludes all forms of religion that is anti-culture to the African. I don't care what that religion is. If there is a religion that is anti-culture to the African, that religion has no place in our society. If you have a religion that states that you have to kill people who do not believe in what is it that you believe, then I wonder whether ghosts, rats, cats, dogs, or pigs will have to become the converts into that religion, because what happens if you kill everybody else who do not believe in what you believe in? Because at some point in time, there will be people who basically says, you know what, forget this stuff. You're not going to compel us to believe in something that we do not believe. Every religion has to be that peaceful. And I think that on the religious front, I see this primarily because of Boko Haram, on the religious front, we have to be able to destroy this ideology, this mindset that you have to belong to a particular group, believe in something, otherwise you have to pay with your own blood. That's, to me, it's not African. That, to me, does not push the African agenda. And so if there is anybody on the continent of Africa who is black skin, dark skin, I want them to understand that historically, we have to look at the role that religion has played in slavery to understand that the most enslaved people in the world were black Africans. Black Africans. That should be enough to tell every black African who is speaking of the gun, you know, in the name of religion, be it Islam, be it Christianity, that the most enslaved people in the world were black Africans in sub-Saharan Africa, not even North Africans, not the Berbers in North Africa, that a lot of black Africans were enslaved, shipped out of sub-Saharan Africa, you know, through the Sahara, into Medinas, into Saudi Arabia, likewise into the Americas. We have to find ways in which we understand that religion will not save us outside of our humanity. The African must have the consciousness that he's human, that humanity is the first religion. No child is born in this world with a religion. The first religion of every child that is born is humanity. The day we lose our humanity, no religion will be able to save us, period. I don't care what that religion is.
Thank you, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, for your contribution on today's edition of the program. Meanwhile, we've been informed that we have Dr. LIVANCLIFF BIANKE, who just joined us. Good day to you, sir. Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon, Dr. LIVANCLIFF. While we're hoping that you unmute your mic and get to us, we now proceed to today's edition of the program. Just to mention that we're discussing the forceful displacement of persons across the African continent and seeing how we can bring to the table solutions on how Africa can prevent this global phenomenon that is plaguing the African continent. Just to mention, of course, that the reports are done for us by the IDMC, which we are capitalizing on today's edition, mentioned that forceful displacements of persons across the African continent were linked to conflict and violence. Back to you, Dr. Stanley. You earlier on mentioned that the African continent would have to invest into education system rather than dive into a vocational training of persons to be able to curb this global challenge. Now we are looking at the education system on the African continent that we have mentioned on several occasions needs to be revamped for it to be able to live up to standards, because we are in the 21st century in a contemporary society where times are changing. Now, looking at the education system, how can African countries actually capitalize on education to solve this problem of forceful displacement of persons?
Well, the reality is, as people do migrate, people do move, children will move along with them, and those who are in school will have to be displaced as well. The United Nations, must find ways, and most African communities that are and NGOs must find ways in which we are able, via satellite technology, to be able to have tablets and laptop computers with young people. If you're on the run, you can be on the run and still studying. One way or the other, be it using solar energy systems, or inverters, to be able to allow these people to have some kind of power to power up their systems. One way or the other, we have to be able to find ways in which young people continue to study as they migrate. Reasons being that, obviously, we are not even talking about the right form of study yet, just that they must have access to some form of technology that will allow them to be able to study. We have to be able to build platforms across the continent that allow young people to have access to the right form of education free of charge. This will be using microwave technology. There are some certain things I have done in the past that will allow kids to be able to have access in the country where you don't have to have internet to be able to have access to those courses. You just need to be able to have access to a cell phone tower. And if that was going to be the case, companies like MTN and some of those companies, should be able to mandatory participate in programs like this. If not, tax the living daylight out of them, period. That's just the way it is. There's nothing else. They should be able to allow us to be able to have access to those towers so that we can have those platforms, which is basically off the grid. It's an intranet platform where we have young people have access to servers that has this technology, that has lectures on them that will improve and help them in tech space and in any other things that they want to study. I think that that's what we do. If we are sitting and hoping that we probably may have to revamp the educational system across the continent of Africa, the bottlenecks for that is too much and it is too slow. I think that the only way for us to basically do that is to literally superimpose whatever stuff we are trying to do over the educational system. And the way to do that is to take that on an internet or an intranet application that young people can have access to anywhere they are, across the continent. And hopefully, the only limitations we probably might have will be those in rural areas. But I'm thinking that if somebody in some remote part, of Africa can have access to a cell phone and be on WhatsApp, they should also have the capacity to have access to this platform, which to me is no longer a limitation, to have access to these platforms so that they can be studying the right things. That will be what brings about economic development and will obviously improve the livelihood of the people. This will obviously bring about job creation because once they've learned new skills, they become marketable. And then if they basically learn the new skills in those environments in which they're in, they can also work from those environments if it means, working remotely as most people do now across the world.
Exactly, that is a very good initiative which the continent will have to tap into as far as growth and development is concerned, because it's going to go a long way to boosting the economic trajectory of the country or place in which they find themselves. Now, we just got indication that NADYNE is back with us. You're welcome back. Please kindly proceed. We mentioned that there are several humanitarian challenges faced on the African continent with regards to the forceful displacement of persons. Could you elaborate on that? NADYNE, are you with us? Okay. Please kindly proceed. Due to some technical issues, we're unable to get you, NADYNE, but hopefully you're going to get back to us and proceed with your contribution on the show. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the technical hitches. We just proceed with Dr. Stanley FONGOD. We are aware that we have technical or say psychological effects that are linked to internal displacements of persons, especially ones that are involuntary, because about 1/3 of displaced persons are likely to experience what we'll say high rates of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorders, that's PTSD, as well as a result of circumstances in which they may find themselves due to migration. Now, with all these post or say psychological effects linked to migration or involuntary migration, how can the African continent address this problem or say this effect from this global challenge?
We literally must be able to have folks who are trained in this field to address these issues. And I think that there's a huge space as an opportunity for a lot of people to be engaged, met and talk with young people who are actually in this field, who are counseling, talking, helping, coaching, those who have gone through this ordeal, and encouraging them and finding ways in which they can be able to emerge out of that which they are facing now. The only issue I have with all of this is that I'm hoping that we can be able to get to a place where the government is heavily involved, of these individual countries, where they're heavily involved in helping these people, especially having them through some kind of a program, some kind of a system. Well, it's not just enough to be able to help somebody psychologically who has gone through such a traumatic event, and those with PTSD. We need to be able to find ways where that is treated, okay, from the medical front, not just not just counseling, but somebody who is actually certified to be able to handle this. And I think that this also goes to those in the diaspora who are dealing with mental health. There's a lot of folks in the diaspora who are dealing with, who basically are certified doctors in the mental health, that needs to be able to come back home and set up clinics across the continent, to be able to help those who desperately do need this help. Plenty of Africans who have gone through this are suicidal, and some of them are dying long after the gun would have stopped sounding, by self-inflicted wound. Either they hung themselves, jump over a bridge, or do something to themselves, drug poison or whatever. A lot of folks are dying. We need to be able to address this, because then the casualty of these sad events will continue to pile up. Outside of that, I think that we really must be able to take vocational training to a new level, especially for those who are recovering from this traumatic disorder, from this traumatic stress, disorders that they have experienced as a result of the war. There have to be a way in which we actually train young people, give them something to look up to. When somebody, I've forgotten which philosopher, I think it's Voltaire, who says that when a why is known, you can endure anyhow. When you know the whys of anything, why you're doing it, you can endure anyhow, which
Absolutely.
means that there's no difficulty that can actually come to you that will be able to challenge you beyond your capacity to handle, because you know what you want, you know where you're going. I think that if we basically get young people vocational training, especially the IDPs, that will eventually help us to be able to elevate, the pain they are going through, giving them something to look forward to. That will be the first step to the deliverance, first step to their integration into society, so they can look forward to something, not look backwards. If a future can be brighter, then the horrors of the past will not mean anything.
Yeah, actually, Africans should be able to look at the future and rather the horrors of the past. Now, that evokes Africa unity, because you mentioned we have the diaspora that needs to come back to the continent and see how they can salvage Africa from, say, the wars it might be going through. But then, looking at African solidarity, not to put a question on that aspect of the continent, but then how can African solidarity limits or curb this aspect of forceful internal displacements of persons from one region of the continent to the next?
Look, one of the things that we have done, I don't know whether it was intentional or not, is that we have been talking about conflicts without addressing why these conflicts are actually occurring in the first place. We've talked about the consequences of the conflict. which basically speaks of the internal displacement of people, but then the conflicts by themselves have not been addressed. And I think that this is where, especially those in the diaspora, plays a vital role, and an integration of the African continent as a whole plays a vital role. We have to get into a place where it's a no-no for any African who is in power to engineer any form of aggression on the people. I don't care what your name is, I don't care where you're coming from. The moment you are involved in any of this, you need to basically go to the Hague, period. If you will be responsible, okay, for the killings of other Africans, then we basically need to have a special place where we take you. There has to be a place where we take you. And the reasons for that is because there's no other way for us to be able to curb this issue than that. There are two factors here. First of all, foreign influence is, important. And secondly, another thing would be, our own dictators and those in power who basically take their marching orders from those who are outside of the country. A prime example as to one of the things that we need to do is to mobilize on the African continent on a massive scale, massive protest against companies like Apple. Apple single-handedly has the capacity to put an end to the conflict in the Congo, but Apple will not. Because Apple is benefiting tremendously from the war that is taking place in the DRC. So the reality is, if you own an iPhone, that iPhone is built on Congolese blood. DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. That iPhone has human blood laced all over it, because the key technology, the key technology that is in most of our phones, the main ingredients is actually coming in from the DRC. So we have the actual cover. 30% of the world deposit is actually in the DRC. We have to be able to make sure that we put an end to this, not just by talking about it. We have to do so by our own purchasing power also. If the African will refuse to purchase the iPhone and will raise tremendous hell on the African continent in relationship to the iPhone, the conflict in the DRC will come to an end. As long as there is a buyer, someone will always supply. This will be a supply and demand thing. Once somebody is willing to buy, there will be somebody who is willing to sell. Unfortunately, it's at the expense of the African blood. We have to find ways to put an end to that also.
Yeah, you mentioned the causes of conflict, which was escaped. But then, looking at conflicts on the African continent and violence, we sometimes turn to attribute these forceful displacements of persons just to this phenomenon and natural disasters, not to forget. But aside this, what other aspects on the African continent could be causing persons to involuntarily move from their homes of origin to settling in other places as IDPs?
Well, I think infrastructure development will play a vital role, and this is why most of our villages on the continent of Africa are being emptied, why our cities are basically, increasing in volume. And the reason is because of infrastructure development. There has to be a way in which we basically help bring about infrastructure development on the continent of Africa. And one of the ways I think we should be able to do that is that we need to be able to create routes, right? There has to be routes on the continent or in most of our African countries that link up rural areas to the cities. What's happening in the cities? We have the best hospitals in the cities, the best schools are in the cities. Life is better in the cities in terms of livelihood. We have electricity a little bit more constant in the city than you do in the rural areas. And obviously the government is catering for those in the cities, because the cities is where most of those who work for the government actually do lease. So obviously, they are benefiting a whole lot more than those who are living in the rural areas. And there's a mass exodus of people from the rural areas into the cities. The problem with the city life is that those who are supposed to be involved in things like agriculture needs to be in the rural areas, because that's where people do actually have land. Those who can buy land have free land, certainly free land, which is family land in the villages where they can actually be able to farm. We have to be able to deal with the issues of infrastructure. In the event where you have good roads, highways that link up the rural areas into the cities, where somebody can have 2 hours journey, an hour journey, from the rural areas into the cities, nobody wants to live in the city. You will have people who will be walking in the cities and living in the rural areas. There has to be a way in which we bring about infrastructural development and basic services across the continent, so we can also help, disenfranchise the ideas of people moving from rural areas into urban areas, because that is another form of internally displaced people.
Exactly, those are some of the causes. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, just to note that Africa might be faced with a lot of challenges which could be hampering or hindering or somehow impacting the proliferation of these movements of persons from one part of Africa to another. Now, we should recall that a few days ago we saw the Cameroonian military that rescued over 300 civilians that had been captured by Boko Haram. You mentioned that in one of your analyses. And it's not just a problem. We recall that in 2000, some years back, we're looking at 10 years ago, we saw Nigerian students, the Chibok girls, that were being abducted. But that problem was not resolved. And over years, we've seen Africans being turned to move. You cited the Democratic Republic of Congo. Let's recall the Rwandan genocide that prompted persons to move from where they were, and they're still trying to recover from the trauma, which was some of the aspects or effects of these movements. Now, with all this in mind, looking at the African continent, how can policy and decision-making at the level of governments across Africa be able to secure this aspect across Africa?
Excuse me, please, can you just repeat the question? Just the last part of it, I didn't get that.
Okay.
I think that we had an issues in connection.
Okay, so the question was looking at decision on government policy making and decision making across the African continent. When we look at all these factors that surround looking at past events, present day events on the continent, how can, at the level of the government, how can they implement measures that could curb this problem of forceful displacements of individuals across Africa?
First of all, those who are in power must make sure that they don't cherry pick as to where it is that infrastructural developments are created, where new government ideas and initiatives are basically instituted. There have to be a way in which we are able to do so based upon merits. And obviously what would be the best cost-benefit analysis for a particular people, and also go to some other areas and be able to bring things to them that do matter. Prime example, if you're going to be able to build a school, all right, you have to be able to make that is basically quite open for everybody else. Everyone needs to be able to participate in that. You have to make sure that we have universities across the region. Reasons being, you want folks who are across the region to be able to benefit from education. Bring education closer to where they live. If you're going to create up whatever industry you're trying to create up, create industries that are closer to where the raw materials are, and different parts of the country will benefit based upon whatever it is that is in that particular environment. But when you decide to basically put a rubber plantation in the far north, then you are absolutely, for example, I'm using this case, for example, like Cameroon, if you have to put a rubber plantation in the far north, where rubber itself is actually farmed, in the southwest region, and just because you are from the far north, you decide to put the rubber plantations from the far north, that's crazy. These are some of the things which we basically are talking about, that you need to be able to find ways in which you bring development to a particular country where everybody shares in the equity. Everybody has the capacity to benefit from whatever it is that is coming out of that particular country or that particular part of the country. If you look at folks who are in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the worst places to live on planet Earth is actually a place called Goma. Goma literally has everything that humanity is looking for so far as minerals are concerned. But those in Goma, on a daily basis, are mostly working on force, not even tools like monkeys. Why? Because they have to duck every single moment of the day because of the sound of an AK-47. It's a war zone. That is not what we're looking for. That is not the model for the Africa that we want. That is not the model for the Africa that we aspire for. We are looking on, and this is now for the African continent, where we basically bring each and every African to a place where they can benefit from that which the government has to offer and spread out the resources, not just building hospitals in particular communities because the Minister of Health is from that particular area. No, build hospitals everywhere, set up research centers, hospitals in all parts of the country. If somebody needs emergency surgery, the person does not have to travel 6 hours for that surgery. The person can, maximum travel should be an hour. If we start from that, then I think that, you know, we can start thinking about how the government can absolutely start dealing with some legitimate partnership, also with NGOs, to foster people and give them incentives not to be moving, and give the incentives to stay where they are and develop their areas and communities and maintain their heritage, maintain their cultures, because we absolutely need those cultures, you know, for future generations to come.
Absolutely. Now, borrowing from your story of earlier on, how can individuals, us as Africans at our various levels, how can they ensure that they too have a key role to play when it comes to helping those persons that have been forcefully displaced from their homes to be able to find a safe haven in wherever they locate?
I will borrow from, I don't know who said this, that no condition is permanent. I've forgotten, but I don't know, it's Lapiro. I think it's Lapiro. I'll borrow from Lapiro Dembanga, the old Cameroonian singer, who says no condition is permanent. And so the idea is, you know, do unto others what you want it to be done unto you. Treat others the way you want to be treated. The truth of the matter is that it was not of no fault of their own. Anything can happen to anybody at any time. And just because it's not happening to you today does not mean it does not have the capacity to happen to you tomorrow. If you become mean, cruel, and bitter on someone who is basically going through hell, if you think that you have the capacity to sit and basically mock, marginalize someone because of that which life has dealt with them, the truth is they are going through what they are going through because time and chance has given them that in this moment in time. You have to be kind. You have to be friendly. You have to express certain levels of kindness. You have to put a lending hand, give somebody a cup of water, you know, sacrifice a meal, sacrifice your shoe, sacrifice a shirt. Tell somebody it's going to be all right. And to those who are participating in non-profit organizations and they are looking at this crisis and they're building homes and enriching themselves, shame onto you. If you are using money that is supposed to go to these folks and then suddenly you bought a car for yourself, and then the idea is I have an NGO which is basically seems to be the big business in Cameroon, shame onto you. You are crazy. You are insane for doing so. There are folks who are legitimately in need of this, people who are dying, people who can't pay hospitals bills because they have nothing. They used to be cocoa farmers. They are nobody now. They used to farm things. They're displaced. They can't do anything. And yet the money that's supposed to be for them, you know, you're driving in a car. And I wanted to say, let me not say that, but shame onto you. I hope that, you know, you can somewhat be able to make sure you do good to those who are supposed to be the benefactors of, you know, what is it that you've received. Those who are supposed to benefit from all of this money that you received in the name of NGOs, let them benefit from that. I think that will be the general idea so far as I'm concerned. Be a good neighbor. You know, just be a good neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. I think I was going to borrow from the Christian text. There's a line that says, love your neighbor as yourself. Do so. It will be good for the country. It will be good for the continent. It will be good for the African.
Absolutely. Africans should find one another as brothers and sisters. Now, before we gradually come to the end of today's edition of the program, Africa is known to have numerous challenges, amongst which, like we've mentioned in the course of the show today, conflict, violence, disasters, and a host of others. Now, what are some of the biggest challenges, aside from the impact of what we're seeing today as the forceful displacements of persons on the African continent? What are some of those challenges that the African continent needs to address for it to be able to, say, emerge at the economic fronts, at the, say, political front, and at the level of so many fronts that are peculiar to the growth and development of Africa?
Before we can be able to do anything, we need to know exactly what is it that we're dealing with. Number one, I think that the biggest problem on the African continent will be the issues of data collection. We absolutely have no record as to what what is actually happening. We have no data, we have no monitoring systems, we do not really know what's going on. Everything that we hear is just little things filtering left and right. But the truth is, if we cannot truly be able to collect data, we will not know exactly what to do and how to do it. We are talking about skill. How do you, at what quantity, at what scale, how do you be able to help a people if you don't know exactly how many people you're supposed to help? The continent of Africa is known for absolutely either manipulating data or having no data at all. And people will choose not to collect data. People will inflate data. They'll do whatever they want to do with data based on whatever stuff that they want to benefit from. But I think that if we're going to actually be able to build up or bring out solutions that is meaningful, we must be able to improve ourselves in the area of data collection. And that simply means we must basically have people who are able to monitor. That means people who are journalists, people who are, either they are state or non-profit operators, folks who are on the ground, who are reporting in good faith, rather than just having these arbitrary numbers that people throw around that means nothing, because in the end, you don't know exactly how to help, who you're helping, and where the help needs to go. It becomes a very fluid situation where we do not know exactly what's going on. I think we need to be able to have good data collection abilities on the continent of Africa, and also have folks who have the capacity to be on the ground and monitor either in areas of elections or folks like what's happening in Cameroon, in the DRC. We need to be able to have folks on the ground who are walking on the ground collecting data. It's on that data that we can actually be able to build up meaningful solutions as to what to do and where to do it.
Now, speaking of data collection across Africa, now do you think that the data that has been collected so far on the African continent is actually a true reflection of what is on ground?
The data collection that has been collected on the African continent is as good as ES-SONEL or no? INEO, I think they call them INEO in Cameroon. It's as reliable as INEO, is as reliable as NEPA in Nigeria. All right, that is how good the data on the African continent is. It's garbage. It's trash, total trash, absolute trash. I say this. And this even goes across, different sectors. The thing is, for some reason, it's as if to say those who are paid to collect data have this sense that the more data you collect, then the more meaningful the data is. Data collection has nothing to do with volume. Data collection is data collection. I don't just know what to say. It's like the sample size that we get, all right? It's most likely not the issue, but the methods in which most of us collect data on the continent of Africa, statistically, you can't do nothing with it. It's just pure trash. We have to be able to do better. We must have folks who have legitimate incentives to be able to collect data the right way, and then so that we can be able to interpret the data. If you collect data and the data in itself is trash, there's nothing you can do. You're going to come up with all kinds of basically, I said the whole industry will full of allies because none of those data will basically match anything. So we need to be able to have folks who believe, who has the capacity to go in the field, collect data, meaningful ways of collecting the data, and adhere to all the values and the principles of data collection that are not influenced by governments, that are not influenced by folks who say, don't say this, don't say that, you can't report that, you can't report this. The truth of the matter is that holistically, the picture is muddy, the picture is in very, we have low resolution, it's not high resolution thinking, no high resolution data collection. It is fuzzy. You look at it at the bigger picture, you can't see anything else because the data that was collected is pure trash. Again, data collection on the African continent, if you're from Nigeria, it's NEPA. If you're from Cameroon, it's NAO. Very unreliable.
Now, looking at this aspect which you mentioned so far, looking at data centers across the African continent, do you think that the African continent, especially at the level of the governments, would have to, say, invest in these sectors, say, in the creation or opening of data collection centers in a bid to have data from the continents, or say from the field, that actually truly reflects what is on ground?
Right. So if you statistically, if you look at companies like MTN and all those tech companies, they have somewhat the most reliable data depending on whatever demographics or metrics you're looking at. They do, and because they have a digital footprint to be able, to gather that and report on that as well. But my problem on the continent is not even about us having data centers in relationship to data collection. The issue is the way in which those data are collected. For example, if you're going to collect data on something like COVID-19, okay, how many people really had COVID-19? I'm just giving an example, okay, so nobody should come after me. There's a particular country which is called Country A. And that particular country A was promised by international community that if there are 5,000 people who are diagnosed with, who have been diagnosed with or tested positive for COVID-19, then they're going to give an X amount of money to them, right? So if that country decides that they're going to inflate that number, the reality is maybe only 100 and something people within that particular country actually had COVID-19. So imagine that there was going to be a particular drug that was being developed, and it had to be that drug's development would be based upon, people from a particular region testing in higher volumes, for COVID-19. That particular company would be using false data to be able, to build up a particular drug that has nothing to do with reality, because the initial data collected was engineered by folks who wanted money rather than what was true. The point is, it's hard for us to know what is going on the African continent because those collecting the data are in the pockets of those who are paying for the data to be collected. Everybody is cooking something up. So we cook the books on the continent of Africa, for our own selfish interest.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, for your contribution on the edition of the program. To wrap up now, in your opinion, what is your closing remark with regards to today's topic of discussion on how the continents can prevent the forceful displacement or internal displacements of individuals?
But now I think we need to be able to have some kind of an international support. If the international community is not going to help us, then we need to build partnerships with other countries and NGOs where we can be able to help us and help ourselves. The reality is this is where we are on the African continent, and our situation is not unique. All right, it's taking place in Israel as we speak. Ukraine is basically boiling over as we speak. And so, at this particular point, we can't be relying on the West. The West is not coming. The West is literally looking at themselves. So we have to start depending on us. We have to find ways to depend on us on the continent. And if that was going to be the case, then the committees, and head of states on the African continent must come together, where each and every one of us becomes one community with a Pan-African agenda where we look at every African, whether you're from the Congo, you're from Cameroon, you're from Ghana, Nigeria, as Africans, not as a Congolese, not as a Nigerian, not as a Cameroonian. What I'm looking at is an African. We are Africans first. We were Africans first. Whatever levels Europeans gave us came later. These international boundaries on the continent of Africa is not what it was there in the first place. So we need to be able to make sure that we treat Africans as Africans. And remember, you have to be your brother's keeper. With that, whenever there are conflicts, we'll look for those solutions and somewhat changes will come. While we're waiting for the changes to occur, let us help the African be Africans and let us be one another's keeper.
Africa needs to be one another's keeper. Of course, unity is strength. Thank you immensely, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, for your contribution and for taking our time to join us on today's edition of the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Sharon. I appreciate you. Hope to see you again.
Hope to see you again too. Ladies and gentlemen, it's on that note that we draw down the curtains of today's edition of the program of your Pan-African channel. You're watching us on 4U Television. Meanwhile, you're listening to us on 4U Radio FM 96.3. We're streaming live on YouTube. Thank you for being through with us in the course of the program. We'll say keep the rendezvous for Friday next. Thank you.